Well, this is the cleanup team here.
Time to get hyped. Get hyped. Get hyped.
So if nothing else, we're going to have some fun. But let me start by actually waving around an original. Ooh, I've been carrying this for 40 years. So I'm finally able to wave it around. And it's falling apart, and it's dog-eared and everything else. But here it is, 40 years later. Still as relevant in many ways as it was back then. But to flip it, the world has changed. So that's what we're going to try to bridge here. Let me offer a couple of opening remarks. I'll quickly introduce the panel, and then we'll spend some time on our questions. As we all know, it's the 40th anniversary of the document. It was produced by a group that came to be called the National Commission on Excellence in Education, and the word excellence is important, and we'll come back to that. It was appointed by then Secretary of Education Ted Bell, and it worked for 18 months. So this was not a group that just flew in and spent a few minutes thinking about these issues. Worked for 18 months. They had panels all over the country. Actually, in the back of the publication, they list all the papers they commissioned and places where they had hearings and so on and so forth. So this was not just your ordinary little group of people in a room by themselves trying to figure out what the world was like and how it was changing and what should be changed. They spent some serious time thinking about these issues. Now, 40 years later, we could look back and say, well, they missed that, they missed that. Well, sure they did. But this was a serious group of people. With reference to a point that actually Bill Kristol made this morning, no other national report on education had ever been addressed to the American people, and this one was. That was an interesting twist. We can come back to that if you want. Prior conversations were mostly among professional educators. The committee of 10 or 12, these were all sort of the elite folks of the university world talking to the rest of the world, but the rest of the world was themselves. It wasn't the American people. Ted Bell, in his memoir, which is actually a fascinating memoir called The 13th Man, a Reagan cabinet memoir, and he was the 13th member of the cabinet, and the cabinet position was the newest cabinet created in 1979. That's another story there. So this was a brand new cabinet position, and what the role of the secretary was very ill-defined, even though there had been one toward the end of the Carter administration. He has an interesting sentence in there are two chapters in his memoir on the report. I picked out one sentence, which was his rationale for the report, and this is a quote. "We needed some means of rallying the American people," again, an open letter to the American people, "around their schools and colleges, and educators also needed to be shaken out of their complacency." So they were looking for some way of shaking everyone out of what they describe as complacency. Let's fast forward 5 years later, on the 5th anniversary of the report, so 35 years ago, a guy by the name of Ed Fisk, if you don't recognize his name, he was the education reporter for the New York Times, and he was there as education reporter for 17 years, wrote an interesting article in the Times on the 5th anniversary of the report, and he writes the following about the report. "It was 35 pages that shook the U.S. education world, becoming one of the most significant documents in the history of American public education." So here we are 40 years later with a terrific panel to discuss some of the main themes of the report under the session entitled "The Twin Goals of Equity and High-Quality Schooling." In one sentence, I'll give you a description of our panel members, and the rest you can look up in the material you have. This is Phyllis Lockett, who is CEO of LEAP Innovations and Education Technology Hub in Chicago. Then we have Aimee Guidera, who is Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And on the far right, no reference to his political inclinations. And if you know Derrell, you know that's accurate. President of 50CAN, the 50-state Campaign for Achievement Now. So let's kind of really jump into this, and I'm going to go back, as all good people should, to the text. To the text.
I know we're doing Socratic method up here.
Right. And read you a section from the text in the section entitled Excellence in Education. I'll do it quickly, and then we'll ask each of the panelists to start to sort of reflect on that and how they might accept it or reframe the way this issue is talked about. We define excellence in education to mean several things. At the level of the individual learner, it means performing on the boundary of individual ability in ways that test and push back personal limits. Excellence characterizes a school or college that sets high expectations and goals for all learners, then tries in every way possible to help students reach them. Excellence characterizes a society that has adopted these policies. We do not believe that a public commitment to excellence and educational reform must be made at the expense of a strong public commitment to the equitable treatment of our diverse population. The twin goals of equity and high-quality schooling have profound and practical meaning for our economy, our society, and we cannot permit one to yield to the other either in principle or in practice. All right, so that's the sort of frame here. To our panelists, quick sort of reactions to the issue that this brings up.
You want me to start?
All right.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. You know, I strongly believe in equity and excellence. I don't think we have anywhere near delivered on that. So we all know the one thing that has held our country together is this ideal that if you work hard and you lean in and you make sacrifice, you can have access to the American dream. And that premise is, we're breaking that promise to students every single day. So the notion and the idealism of having equity and excellence, I do strongly believe in. I think that was well said. I do not believe we are consistently delivering on that at all, in particular for Black and brown and low poverty children in this country.
I'll add, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for being the stalwart staying till the very end, and there's cocktails after this, so that's a good thing. So I reread the report as well, and I think that this, what you just read, Bruno, is so applicable today, and the entire report is. It's really, everyone should have homework to reread this report because it's very, very relevant. We don't use the word equity in Virginia. Governor Youngkin believes that it's a damaged word, right? It's a word, and we should learn this in education, that when we label things or call things, it gives something a target to look at. And at this point, equity means so many different things to so many different people. So in Virginia, we use the term opportunity. And so when we think about the question that you had, you cannot have access to excellence for everybody unless you think about how do you ensure that we're providing equal access to opportunity, equal access to innovation, equal access and equal expectations of high expectations for every child. So in Virginia, our mission is that in education is at all levels is to ensure that we're preparing every single Virginia learner for success in life. And we determine that three ways, and it's very reminiscent of what you just read. It's success in being a productive member of the economy, it's success in being an engaged member of their community, and success in being a productive member of the economy, but also an informed member of the democracy. Those are themes that we've been talking about all day long. And it matters that that is everybody, right? We fail if we lose people, and at this point, we can't afford to lose anybody. In Virginia, we have 300,000 jobs we cannot fill. Part of that is skills mismatch. We need to make sure that we're investing in everyone and doing it. And when I think about why I am a passionate fan about the policy lever of greater transparency in data, especially longitudinal data, it's because it allows us, and in fact, it demands that we see every learner, we meet every learner where they are, and we hold the system accountable for getting every learner where they need to go. That's why, and when I think about opportunity, or some people might call it equity, making sure we have that access to opportunity, and also expectations that are high for every single one of our learners matters absolutely if we're going to have a productive and vibrant economy, as well as a vibrant community and a democracy.
Okay, this is hard. I want to add something meaningful. I don't know if I'm capable of that. So just like a couple of quick things. The first one is I do think the word equity is damaged. I know that in my work, we used to sort of all know what that meant together. You know, if you were any kind of kid, if you were a low-income kid, if you're a kid of color, you're in a zone to an underperforming school, we were going to get you whatever you needed so that you could become the best version of yourself, sort of live at the edge of personal limits, as Bruno talked about earlier. And I think now so many people think so many different things about that word that it is not helpful. And so I just throw that out there as a former creature of the marketing world to say that, like, you shouldn't be a bad American and go to a foreign country and think that if you just say something in English louder, it will work, right? So that's one thing. The second thing I would just say is that there's sort of like a schizophrenia around this like equity and excellence thing that I think is playing itself out in ways that are incredibly telling. And I'll just sort of like add like 2 examples. One is the plague of grade inflation. So on the one hand, like, yes, we say we want excellence, right? Or we say we want all kids achieving at a high level, but nobody wants to get the message that, like, yeah, you need to work harder, right? And so we've basically assuaged that anxiety by, through grade inflation or through a whole bunch of other things that are, either like touchy-feely or not touchy-feely. And I'm for diverse definitions of success, so I know I'm being like a little flip here, but I just want to highlight that as one thing. But on the other end of it, I think it's sort of a little more pernicious. So I happen to be on the board of Success Academy charter schools, and we do the equity and excellence thing like really, really well. And people don't want us to exist anymore, right? And so we can see this sort of present itself in like an income dyad, right? If you're wealthy, if you've paid for your fancy school, it's bundled into your mortgage, whatever, you want your 4.0. If you're a low-income kid and you're enrolled in a school that is breaking all the rules and changing the paradigms for you, we want that to go away, right? And so I would just highlight that I believe in these 2 things, but I think these are 2 powerful examples of how Americans continue to have difficulty reconciling those things with their own lives.
Okay, we could spend endless time just on this, so we're going to move along, but to keep this conversation in the back of your mind as we talk about some of these other issues. I've been told I have to hold this here because this isn't working, but an Italian can never just. Okay, so I will do my best. Okay, let's move on to another issue here. If you read this document or if you've been around for a while, you know that there are phrases in the document that are just memorable. You say the phrase and people say, oh, I know that one. Here's one. Everyone is probably, the rising tide of mediocrity. Let me tie that to what I think is a really good definition of the problem that Nation at Risk got the nation and the public to focus on. And then we'll talk about that a little bit. The ideal of academic excellence as the primary goal of schooling seems to be fading across the board in American education. So it's pretty clear what they thought the goal should be of schooling. And then their description of the problem was that there was a rising tide of mediocrity that was kind of working against this primary goal of schooling. Coming out of this attempt to deal with this issue was a particular kind of approach to reform that came to be called, to just get to the point of it all, standards-based reform, and the accountability movement. And accountability meaning make sure it's clear what kids are supposed to know and be able to do, and we'll test them, and then there are consequences, and it all seems so rational, so easy to get a handle on. Let's talk about this approach now. I think, Aimee, you're going to start on this one and talk a little bit about some of your experiences in Virginia here, and then we'll ask the other 2 panelists to kind of pipe in.
So Governor Youngkin came into office with the goal of restoring excellence to education for all Virginians. And when I would go in front of the General Assembly last year and start testifying, this is the response I got. How dare you say that there's not excellence in Virginia. And I would say, I can show you the data that there's not excellence available to every student in Virginia. I became a Virginian the first time because my husband went to law school, the Scalia Law, and we stayed for the public schools in Fairfax County, right? So I was a consumer, and I chose, and I went there because there was excellence. That is not the case for every family in Virginia, and I'd say fewer and fewer families have that access today. And so we started really focusing on how you do that, and you have to use data to do it. But in Virginia, there is not an awareness that that rising tide of mediocrity has been creeping up. In fact, last year, just to give you a data point, and we could go on forever and ever about this, but NAEP came out. All of our data for the last 3 years has been going just down for every single level demographic of kids. NAEP comes out, and I will just give you one of the horrific data points.
Every Virginian in here is like, shh.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, and that what the story was that every single population went down, but in fourth grade in particular, we had in Virginia a heartbreaking results of the largest learning loss in the nation for both our reading and our math for our fourth graders. And this is Virginia, right? Virginia, where everyone, like the angels sing. And for everything. And it was not just terrible, it was 3 times worse than the national average, which was already terrible. At that same time, we have not a single school in Virginia that is not accredited. And just pause for a second. The story we're telling parents, and Secretary Duncan started the morning talking about this today, the story we are telling parents, taxpayers, policymakers is nothing to see here, everything is awesome, jazz hands. And what we have is the reality is that we are leaving so many kids behind, and we are on the cusp of losing an entire generation of kids, and there is no urgency because people aren't aware that there's a problem, and we keep telling. So when you look at NAEP, we also have the largest gap between proficiency average and how we define proficiency in Virginia. So after the NAEP scores came out, we started talking about this honesty gap, that we're not being honest with the people of Virginia. We're not telling the truth, not because we want to shame and blame, but that it's about creating awareness, and this is a change management issue. You can only change things for good if there's an awareness, that there's a need for change, there's a desire to change, and there's a knowledge about how to change. And that's guiding everything that we're doing, and we're using data. But this frog in the pot, the rising tide of mediocrity, that is, to me, the greatest fear I have for this country and for Virginia, is that we need a report like A Nation at Risk today, and we tried to issue one last May called Our Commitment to Virginia, which put 21 pages of graphs and charts in there to make the case and to show people in the data why we need to restore excellence and what excellence looks like. And so there are so many things that we can talk more about if people care to, but we're doing everything the governor said. We're going to raise the floor, defining proficiency, and we're going to take off the ceiling because there should be no ceiling for what our kids can do. And there's many more to do. But I also just need to say this wasn't just a COVID issue. We can tell you and show you that starting in 2017, our numbers started going down, so 3 years before the pandemic. And I would argue that we can map, and if you want to see this, you can go to our Commitment to Virginia report, which is on our website. When you look at that point, there was really a systemic dismantling of a culture of high expectations that was happening in Virginia. We lowered cut scores. We redefined proficiency to be lower. We made the tests easier. There was just this sense, and I'll say, in the name of equity, that we reduced our commitment to excellence and high expectations for every child. And guess what? The system that was designed, it got the results that the system was designed for. We expected less of kids, we expected less of our schools, and guess what? They produced exactly that. And in Virginia, we know that when we expect more of kids, they can do it because we did it 20 years ago. And that's what we're trying to remind people of. This is not an issue with the kids not being able to do it. This is the fact that the adults have gotten lazy and we have forgotten what excellence looks like in Virginia, and we're trying to restore that.
I just wanted to say, what you described, I think, is endemic of what's happening across the country. I think we're seeing that where I live in Illinois. I'm sure you're seeing it in New York. I mean, this is a national crisis that we're dealing with. And the issue was not employing standards. It's how standards were weaponized in this country, and the reaction that has resulted in that. I struggle with the challenge of not being able to use the word equity.
Right.
That is really a shame in our country. We can't even use the word equity because it has been politicized, right, to mean something on the right and to mean something else on the left. And the notion that we have to lower standards in order to achieve equity is offensive. Yep. It is just absolutely offensive. We can do both. I'm looking at my colleague over here at TNTP who has led the effort in the country to employ and elevate the importance of standards. And if we don't have the appropriate level of standards, but it can't be weaponized as the sheer only benchmark for how we're going to rank and sort kids, how we're going to determine what schools stay open and what schools stay closed. We've got to look at a more balanced performance scorecard around the future of what our students are supposed to be, who we want them to be. Very much like many states like the state of Utah and Nevada have done a phenomenal job building this portrait of a graduate, where they've worked with the local community on the ground level to build and devise a strategy around what that looks like. So we're taking the politics out of it and we're thinking about the student. There's not enough discussion in the landscape about learning to the degree our students are learning and what we should be doing about that. So.
Yeah, I would just,
Give me 1 second. We've slid into actually the third.
Sorry.
I noticed that. I was about to do the third thing, yeah.
And Derrell was going to lead us on that, but to be a little bit more explicit. So we've gotten into the so-called accountability triad, which is standards, testing, and consequences. And is that a useful way to look at the world? Has it sort of outrun its usefulness? Okay, then let's talk about that more specifically. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay, so I was an English major. English majors are getting a lot of hate today, so I'm standing up for English majors. So I like movies, and the thing about heroes in movies is that they are different people, they ask different questions, and they have different assumptions at different arcs in their story because they are different people. And I think that, I know when I started working on ed policy reform in Newark, New Jersey, and on April 17th, 2002, the standards, accountability, sanctions, triad made a lot of sense, right? And drove a lot of policy. I would argue from a rhetorical standpoint, I agree with a lot of what you said earlier, Phyllis. The fact that we were able to, as a nation, sort of shift the public mind over, like along the lines of shine a spotlight on, and like that the gaps were intolerable and all, and that really drove policy for like a decade. Like there was sort of an acceptance that this was unacceptable, and people acted in good faith on that. I think that was incredibly powerful. I think that moment has passed. And when I say that, just to get to this thing about the standards before, I don't say that with any like joy. Like I'm not sort of like a hater and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm so happy it's over. But I do think how people want to define excellence has changed. I think the ability to figure out, to measure success in a lot of different ways is a rational sort of challenge to people who believe in standards, right? And we're sort of like trying to figure that out right now. The second thing I would just say, and I think Secretary Guidera sort of got over it without saying it explicitly, is that in my mind, the ritual of annual assessments is imperiled, right? Because people don't want to get the message. All of our states are fighting to make sure that every year we still find out what's going, how schools are doing, what's going on with kids. But I think this is vulnerable. This is a very vulnerable time. Like somebody might not want to say it out loud, but before the lights turned off, Betsy DeVos was like, "Hey, we're going to keep doing this." It was a big push to continue to have a waiver for annual statewide assessments, right? So I don't think that's completely in the rear view. And I think the opportunity is like, how do we develop a system or systems or devices of measurement that are sort of intrinsically motivating for families and students, right? Like our assessment ritual is for leaders and principals and school leaders, and like certainly parents have learned to make important decisions based on that data. But when I'm talking to our teams about it, I'm like, we need Strava for education. Does anyone know what Strava is? All right, I just let my pants out. I need to know what Strava is more. But that is totally like, that is my information. It is about me, right? It is sticky and valuable and drives behavior. And so I just think that we're at this place now when we're talking about what excellence should be, right, or what standards should be, that it's got to be a more bottom-up external, like there has to be a bottom-up external component to it, as well as the things that we've fought for over the last 20 20 years to help keep institutions accountable and to make sure resources are deployed effectively.
But get specific here. You mentioned you're on the board of Success Academies. So what does that look like?
Oh, so
And you don't have to use Success Academies exactly, but you've been in the world of practice for a while. What might that look like?
yeah, it's interesting. So the one thing about success is, so we have 47 schools and 22,000 kids, I think that's what it is right now, is that it is in a constant state of reinvention. I think people might look at it from the outside and think, okay, well, they have like, you know, a way to get great results on state assessments, and we just do that like over and over and over again. Something is always being destroyed at Success. And something is always being built there. If it's curriculum or if it's a teaching practice or whatever, we have this thing now that we call scholar preparedness, right? Which is a level up from whatever we called it before. That was getting every kid into college, and almost all of them into selective colleges, because that's, you know, selective colleges have money, and financial aid also matters. So I would say that every time I go to a board meeting, we're doing something new. There's a relentless pursuit of executing at a very high level. Effort matters a ton. Like, as an example, somebody will say, well, we looked at student X. The first question, like the second question on the, you know, the assessment, they got wrong. The 10th question, which is the same thing, they got right. And so they diagnose that as effort, right? And then the takeaway is not that there's something wrong with the kid, it's that the teacher didn't help the student, you know, focus on what they needed to do to answer the question well. And I know we've talked a lot about the role of teachers and stuff, and I love teachers. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that, like any human endeavor, the pool of people who do it is variable, right? And we do everybody a disservice if we don't talk about the fact that if we care about excellence, or if we care about equity, or if we care about achievement, or whatever you care, a free and flourishing society, or civil discourse, the adults matter, right? And so they too have to have a high bar of excellence in whatever it is that we want to do if we want to meet the promise of a nation at risk.
Aimee, do you want to add something here? And in particular, the teacher issue, I mean, you're at the state level, and so what does this all mean?
So I would say I'm a deep believer in the need that the agenda works, standards, assessment, accountability. But when I look back over the last 40 years in the standards movement, we forgot to bring along that local level, the parents and teachers. So when I think about assessment, there are lots of policies that we did along the way, namely in 1998 with Race to the Top, which I was a huge fan of, but basically we made it possible for teachers to hate the very thing that they needed the most, which was actionable information about how their kids were doing. And so we took testing, which should have been a really powerful tool for teachers, that every teacher should want in their toolkit, and instead we made it a 4-letter word. And so in Virginia right now, we are committed to raising standards. You all might have heard about our history standards and civic standards. They were in the news quite a bit. I would argue they are probably the best in the nation. I encourage everyone to actually read them, because I think nobody has. But they all have opinions on it. And they're really, really good. And one of the complaints, or the detractors said, you're asking too much of our kids. These are too rigorous. And I said, you know what? I am really pleased to ask a lot of our kids, because I know they can do it. And that's the idea. So we're going to raise standards across the board. We are right now, I missed this morning because I was here listening, we have a work group right now that was statutorily mandated, which we wanted, to look at the future of assessment in Virginia. And I am a deep believer that we must have quality assessment. And yet, back to that point of leaving teachers and parents behind, you know, when tests aren't working for teachers and parents and students, tests aren't working. And so we need to figure out a way to have a commitment to getting actionable, quality, timely information into the hands of the 3 people who need it the most. Students, who we really have not prioritized in this conversation, parents and teachers. And we need to give them the tools to use it and to understand that that data needs to be used not just as a hammer, but as a flashlight. And we need to use it for continuous improvement, and with the idea of not shaming and blaming, but then providing supports to get all of those schools to be successful. And accountability really matters, right? What happened in Virginia is a case study on what happens when you take your foot off of the accountability button, or your finger off of it. the system just basically goes back to mediocrity, that rising tide of mediocrity. We have to have high expectations, and you need to hold people accountable for putting those high expectations in. This is not about the kids. This is about the adults in the system not holding themselves accountable. And that, to me, is one of the most urgent things we need to get right this time, is also to build the incentive systems so that everybody understands the value of high expectations, quality assessments, and then really focusing on that third piece of accountability should be more about continuous improvement while we're holding the system accountable. And we have not gotten that right yet either. And there's an opportunity.
Phyllis wants to say it.
I agree wholeheartedly. One of the things that I worked on when in Illinois, I led the charter school growth movement and helped open about 70 new schools when Arne Duncan was head of our school district. We had the MAP test. So there was a benchmark at the beginning of the year. There was a midterm, benchmark, and you could look at and determine where teachers needed to focus to go deeper in math, reading, and science. And again, because of all of this, the over-testing effort, the translation of these interim assessments, which the system ended up adopting, became part of the accountability system. Now we're over-testing students. So now we have atrophied back to where we were over 20 years ago, where we have one state test, which is given in the spring. And guess when we get the results?
The winter of the following
In
year.
the winter,
Very
exactly. No triangulation, no visibility, no accountability. This is where we are right now, and that's what scares me.
Got two other issues we'd like to talk about before we end. We'll ask Phyllis to at least kick this one off. And we all know we've experienced a pandemic, and now officially as of April, I guess it was April 11th, I think was the date, it's over, all right? But we, the public health emergency is over, but the national education emergency lingers on. Let's talk a little bit about, I keep on being told to hold this by my mouth. I'll put it in this hand. Let's talk a little bit about the world of innovation, and that's a fancy word that's misused, but Phyllis here has been immersed in that kind of work for a bit of time now. So talk a little bit about how you've begun to think about the meaning of the word innovation in the light of the current situation.
Yeah, well, I think we've been talking about it all day, about how we have to rethink the current construct, because it's not working. And it's working for some, but certainly not for all. And what that suggests in my mind is that we've got to think about, again, the future, the portrait of a future graduate, what we want our young people to be able to do in an economy that is moving way faster than our education systems are. That in K-12 as well as higher ed. We need to be thinking about how we are connecting the ecosystem across the learning continuum, from K-12 to higher ed to the workforce. My definition of equity is always comes down to wealth equity. Are we creating economic mobility for our young people? Because if we're not, how are we leveraging those metrics accordingly? So what I have in mind is a system that is connecting learning, that is enabling us to have young people access a broad set of programs and experiences that are virtual, that are in person, that is hybrid, that is preparing young people for the world that we are preparing them to compete in and to thrive in. And that does require a very different paradigm of how we're thinking about teaching and learning right now. It comes down to AI. It comes down to connecting ecosystems of pathways that the previous panel and panels earlier were talking about. And how are we getting young people connected to those pathways that are preparing them for AI, for cybersecurity, for the growth that the World Economic Forum's report is saying is growing. It is a complete disconnect right now.
And talk a little bit about the organization that you oversee and
Sure.
what it does to foster this kind of perspective.
Absolutely. So I started an organization called Leap Innovations to shorten the gap between education and innovation years ago. And we were working with a number of schools across the country to redesign their teaching and learning paradigm to tailor learning to the individual needs of each student. And how then, if an educator is expected to move from a one-size-fits-all construct to one that is tailoring learning for students, you need innovation and technology solutions to help with that, to help educators pinpoint that need, not just through that map test I was telling you we're doing every quarter, but one where you can understand that data every single day, right, and be nimble about it. We need to think about personalized learning in a very different way now. We need to be thinking about it in a way that transcends time, space, and place. This notion that that a student is going to get all that they need in the period of the school day, at the place they happen to be assigned to the teacher they happen to get, is a false premise. And so we've got to redesign the system, and we've got to create the incentives of learning everywhere, just like New Hampshire has, where you are awarding young people credits for learning across different entities, higher ed, CBOs, programs to access certifications and learning experiences to explore and to build their skills. So that's what I'm working on.
So amen. And just to build on that, this whole idea of one size fits all, I think this is the big aha, right, of the last 40 years. One size fits all education does not work for all kids. And if we're going to talk about equity or opportunity, that's the bottom line, is that learners are different. There are different ways that people learn. If you have more than one child in your life, you know this. And yet our school system continues to say, this is how we're going to do it. So one of the things that we're really excited about in Virginia is that we are trying to do this personalization. We are also, to link up to some of the conversations of the prior panel, we believe deeply that one of the issues is that we do not have clear pathways for our students to understand, how do I get from here to here? How do we elucidate that more? And so this administration is all about, how do we provide greater exposure to the worlds beyond the high school walls? How do we provide experiences beyond those walls? And then how do we provide students in high school and middle school, the opportunities to build expertise that they would not normally get in our system right now until afterwards? One of the ways we're going to do that is that we're launching a series of at least 20 labs, innovation lab schools that are a partnership between higher education and K-12 and employers and community partners that are building community schools that are meeting the needs of communities and providing that exposure and experiences and expertise by bringing folks outside of the school walls into the school and vice versa. The other way is Governor Youngkin has stated that the goal should be, by the time of his end of his term, is that a high school graduate will also leave Virginia schools with either an associate's degree and or an industry recognized credential. That changes everything. We know the last year of high schools for lots of kids are just a waste of time. We lose lots of kids, that we lose them in all kinds of ways, that we need to make that learning relevant, and we need to also, to your point, Phyllis, think about less where the learning's happening and then more about what that learning is. And we think this whole focus on industry recognized credentials and associate's degrees and greater partnerships between our 4-year, 2-year, and K-12 systems is critical to creating those pathways and that partnership to making sure that every single learner has access to excellence and innovative in a way that's personalized for their needs.
So I sort of agree with all this. We have this sort of like 1 3/4 of a thing, because I know we're up on it. So we've been talking a lot about like rich kids live in an unbundled world. So they get school, and then they're in an arms race for enrichment all the time, right? And they're doing all these other things, and they have tutoring and trips and all this other kind of stuff. And so like our vision of the future is both like without place, so the New Hampshire paradigm and all this other stuff. But we actually kind of think that that's our equity vision. I know I said you shouldn't use it, but I just used it because we want to close the gap, right, between what poor kids and interested families can do in the out-of-school world and what rich families do. So I just want to like highlight that as part of this. The sort of quarter thing before I like stop is that it's really important. I want to highlight this. We are at the tail end of one of the greatest domestic policy failures of our lifetime, and that is how the opening and closing of schools was handled during the pandemic. We were not on team reopen. Like in March of 2020, I was like, close it all down. But later on, like August, actually, I was kind of like, if you want in person, you should be able to get it. Like, why are we doing this? We could be doing more. There's a lot. And so I think the harm of the last 3.5 years is going to be with us for the next 30, which is incredibly important. And I set that up to say that I really think right now we should be thinking about what's going on in the country from an education policy standpoint, almost as like with an eye toward innovation too, as like a split screen experiment in accountability. So we have the things that Bruno talked about earlier that we talked about, where there are occasionally we get enlightened despots, and it's sort of it's top down for the most part, right? Like we use assessments to get it together. We give the parents some choice and like not much money. Although Virginia's giving people money now, about which I am excited, right? And a bunch of states are inverting that, and they're saying, listen, we're going to give the parents a lot of power and a lot of money and a bunch of options, right? And then we have to figure out the transparency piece, right? The how do we know, which is incredibly important. I think a lot of people are approaching this as like, well, there's a system we have, and then there's a system that's going to like consume the system that we have. You know, maybe it does, but this is the first time in my lifetime we've had options, right? About like how we want to figure out what we want to have, like what we want to let come into existence. And I think that is that sort of dynamism has been missing for a long time. You know, like the first charter school is like 30 years old. You know, remember, I think 30 years ago, if you said, listen, I got this idea, we're gonna start a public school that a district doesn't run, people would have been like, man, you're crazy. And now we're at a place where like a similar sort of energy and dynamism are there. I, for one, am excited about what might happen.
Okay, last question. We've got about 4 minutes. And as you know, we're between them and other things. So let's do a quick round here. So rewrite A Nation at Risk and either add an idea or a thought or reframe it. And I'll start quickly here. If I were to do it all over again, I would shift from what I would call a unitary approach to opportunity to what I'd like to call opportunity pluralism. Namely, if you read the document, you see it talks about K-8 college. That's a kind of unitary approach. When we've heard this all day preached in a variety of ways, a unitary approach. If you want to think about it a little differently without denying that pathway is a valid pathway, we have to think much more about a pluralistic approach to opportunity, offering multiple pathways that people move in and out of along the way. And we've heard that as a theme, I think, over and over and over again today. So I leave it there. Just talk about maybe framing the problem differently and going back to what Secretary Duncan was saying this morning. It doesn't just start at K. Something happens before then, and it doesn't even just end with college. Something happens after that. If you look in the document, there's a section called the Learning Society. And so the Learning Society is one that has a sort of opportunity pluralism approach to preparing young people and preparing all of us. Go ahead.
I think you took the 4 minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Get carried away here.
No, that's great. No, I would, I agree with your points. I would add more around the standards around economic mobility and outcomes. You know, for those of you who could see what Texas just passed yesterday on the higher ed, look at that. Like, tie it to economic mobility outcomes. And I'm going to keep it short.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Secretary.
And I'll just be really fast. It's, to me, it is all about a huge statement and a commitment to saying every single learner needs to be prepared for success in life, and we need to define what that looks like. And then the way you get there is by having greater transparency, greater accountability, using data to make sure that we are actually being accountable to making sure every single student is prepared.
Yeah, I don't know if I would rewrite it, but I would say that the nature of the risk is protean. And when it was first written, it was global competition, right? Or sort of the Cold War. And now I think a lot of people intimated that it was China. But it's also political division, media literacy, deep fakes, et cetera, right? Like postmodernism, views on truth, the ability to glean those things makes it all equally perilous.
Okay, I'm going to close with another quote, go back to the text. The document itself ends in a section called a final word. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but our final word, perhaps better characterized as a plea, is that all segments of our population give attention to the implementation of our recommendations. Again, it was an open letter to the American people. And they list a whole bunch of people and organizations, and it ends, the final paragraph is this: it is their America and the America of all of us that is at risk. It is to each of us that this imperative is addressed. It is by our willingness to take up the challenge and our resolve to see through it that America's place in the world will be either secured or forfeited. Americans have succeeded before, and we shall again. On that happy note, thank you.